Yeah, welcome everybody. So we've got 2 hours of scintillating conversation, I hope, with the 5 of us, and I'm going to do a little bit of talking, mainly listening. I'll get the ball rolling. If anyone has questions, we are going to take them ongoing throughout the whole webinar. So feel free to drop them in now in case you might forget, or anytime before we finish, you can drop questions in and we'll do our best to either answer them by just typing into the Q&A box. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A. So that's for you to ask questions and for us to answer them. So either one of us or our team behind the scenes will type in an answer. If you will need to get website information, or if it's something that actually we want to bring to the panel, then I'll ask you if you want to ask that question yourself. And then your mic will be unmuted. And then you can ask that question yourself. If you'd rather not, then you can just type that in as well, and I will ask the question on your behalf. So that's what the Q&A box is for. The chat box on the bottom is just in case there's any kind of technical issues or things you're not so sure about, then you can pop it in the chat there and that'll come to us. And one thing I really want to tell you about is Rainbow Railroad. So that is a non-profit that we are supporting through this webinar. So we very kindly made it free to join. So welcome everybody. And we invite you that if you would like to make a donation, it's called rainbowrailroad.org. And it's a non-profit that helps people all around the world. I don't know how many countries, but from looking at the website, it's a lot of countries around the world. So the way I see it is the more resources they have, the more countries they're able to go to and help queer people to get resources, to get education, to get support, and in some instances to kind of literally be a railroad to help them get to safety. So hugely important in our big world where a lot of queer people live without a lot of the protections and freedom that we have here, or at least in some parts of America and Canada. So I'll introduce myself basically to start with. My name's David. I'm an Englishman. I live in New Jersey. We were just talking about that. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker. So I've worked for the best part of 15 years in hospitals, psych units, outpatient addiction treatment facilities, helping people, really acute psych and substance use. And I've had a relationship with non-ordinary states of consciousness, which includes psychedelics and cannabis and other things like meditation as well, for the best part of almost 30 years now. And I've realized that the two parts of my life need to dance together and conjoin in my passion, which is working at Psychedelics Today and doing this kind of work. So I've been at Psychedelics Today for a year, and we are a media education and training company. So hopefully you've seen our website that has blogs and podcasts and events on it, psychedelicstoday.com. And you've probably heard our podcast as well with our two founders, Kyle Buller and Joe Moore. I've been doing more podcasting lately. We also do a lot of training. So you can go to our website, psychedeliceducationcenter.com, and we'll pop those in the chat box here. And we've got a lot of trainings that we've produced. Some of them are free, some of them are very affordable, some of them are more expensive. We've got a 12-month certificate course called Vital that's running right now. And we've also got a course called Navigating Psychedelics. And that's a course that I took a couple of years ago. It's a 9-week course, and it literally changed my life and helped me kind of find my way into this career. So Navigating Psychedelics starts on September the 14th. And it runs for 9 weeks, an hour and a half each week, with study groups, lectures, and lots of videos to watch and podcasts in the syllabus. So that's everything I wanted to say about me, I think. I did have your bios handy, but I'm using 2 screens and I can't seem to find. Oh, hang on, I found it. Thank God for that. Let's see where your bios are. So I'm going to introduce everybody, and then I'll open it up for questions from the audience. But I've got one question I definitely want to start with. So first I'll say, who are panel is. First, I'll start with Stephen Huang, is MAP's first Justice, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer, leading teams across the organization to address the psychedelic ecosystem's inequality challenges, as well as its opportunity to provide for collective liberation. Stephen has designed and implemented JEDI strategies for organizations across diverse industries, geographies, and sizes. At MAPS, Stephen is focused on bringing psychedelic healing to all, including marginalized communities, while simultaneously honoring the indigenous cultures from where plant medicines originate. Stephen uses psychedelics to better understand one's innate talents and is constantly inspired by the psychedelic community that's paved the way for a queer Chinese American gender non-conforming activist to join forces with the pioneers of psychedelic assisted therapy. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Happy you're here.
Hello, Amy. Amy Bartlett is a curiosity enthusiast and queer psychedelic geek, currently working on her Ph.D. at the University of Ottawa, Canada. Her research explores the role that psychedelic integration and spirituality plays in individual and communal healing, and her passions include community building, diversity and inclusion in the psychedelic space, harm reduction, and building pathways for safe, accessible, and well-supported experiences with psychedelic substances and non-ordinary states of consciousness. She helps coordinate the Ottawa Psychedelic Education Network, OPEN, and is involved in a variety of psychedelic networks and research communities. She has a law degree as well as her Master's of Law, and before returning to school for her PhD, worked for almost 20 years in human rights and social justice causes in Canada and around the world. Hey, Amy.
Oh, lovely to be here and really excited for the discussion this evening.
And hello, Terence. Terence Ching is a postdoctoral associate at the Yale OCD Research Clinic, where he's involved in the development and conduct of psilocybin clinical trials for OCD. His research and clinical interests are at the intersections of fear, trauma-based disorders such as OCD, anxiety, PTSD, cultural diversity, and psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Hello, Terence.
Hi, nice to be here.
Hey there. And last but definitely not least, hi, Clancy. Dr. Clancy Cavnar is a clinical psychologist in San Francisco in private practice. She completed her dissertation on gay people and ayahuasca in 2011 and has co-edited 11 books with her partner, Bia Labate, and co-founded the Chacruna Institute of Psychedelic Plant Medicines with her. The book she co-edited with Alex Belser and Bia Labate, Queering Psychedelics, will be out in December of this year. Welcome, Clancy.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so here we are. I wanted to start off proceedings by taking a deep breath and asking us all to take a deep breath, but in the audience as well. We're here, so whatever has happened today, with the lowlights and the highlights, with whatever is going on in your life right now, really sit here and be here and enjoy listening and connecting with our wonderful panelists. The first question that I want to ask us, what experiences have we had in our lives, and forget about the difference between personal and professional lives, because in our life, what experiences have we had with non-ordinary states of consciousness that have had a really profound impact in our sense of self, in influencing how we express ourselves, how we love ourselves, how we know ourselves, how we heal ourselves, how we explore, reveal ourselves. And feel free to be as open as you wish, and by no means do you need to kind of plumb the depths, but to what extent you feel comfortable. It'd be lovely just to set the tone by being authentic and queer in that way. Whoever likes to go first, feel free.
I mean, I'm happy to go first. I love that question. And, you know, as we talked about, I like starting from a place of vulnerability as we talk about queerness and identity, because those are the most human parts of our existence in this plane, and something that we don't always get to talk about in these kinds of spaces. So I think I would share actually my very first experience of non-ordinary states of consciousness, it was actually with breath work. And what it sort of is what put me on this path with psychedelics way back in, I think it was 2010. And I had never done breath work and, moved into that space, not expecting much. And I was drowned in a sea of love, golden love falling down, and it became too much. And all of my unworthiness, all of my shame, all of the things that I carry that keep me from love overtook me. And it was a really deep experience of what's possible with authenticity, with truth, with healing, while at the same time, all of the things that keep me from it. And that contrast really put me on the path towards wanting to move towards the light and not drown. I can do this. I can be me. I can be authentic. I can be safe. And it took a while to get to that place of really taking the next steps, but that was my first moment of realizing there was something different and something more in myself and of myself that I could express.
Beautiful. Thank you. Would
I
anyone
can
else
go
like to
after
share?
that,
Yeah,
actually.
Steve.
One of the stories that came to mind, because I have lots, lots of examples using psychedelics to explore authenticity for myself. But one of the ones that I thought about sharing was also kind of my first experience. So why don't we continue that trend? My first experience with non-ordinary states of consciousness was with LSD, and I was lucky to discover LSD in college. And in that period of my life, I was out, but I was really struggling with my sexuality. There was still a lot of repression going on internally. And in order to truly feel like I could be myself and talk the way I want to talk and flirt the way I wanted to flirt, I had to be wasted, practically blackout, And I remember vaguely getting to be the person I wanted to be, and the next day being like, what happened and what did I say, what did I do? And I remember the first time doing LSD, I got to just experience myself and my sexuality in a way that felt really true to myself, and I didn't feel like I was someone else or having to not be who I truly was. I remember having an out-of-body experience, watching myself walk up the stairs of this bar with my friends and be like, whoa, I can actually look down and see myself. And I thought about that moment about, well, there's a different, I felt like I was a character in a Sims game. And it's I can actually do whatever I want to do and be whoever I want to be. And I don't need to be drunk to be gay. I can be as gay as I want anytime. And shortly thereafter that, I actually realized I don't even like drinking at all. So I stopped drinking and I don't drink anymore. And so I credit psychedelics with the wake up and the little shock to my system to realize that actually I don't need to use alcohol to be gay. I can be gay and queer every day. So it's a constant exploration. And I continually get lessons about my gender and sexuality from psychedelics, even to this day.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I can talk a little bit. I had an unhappy childhood, which I don't need to go into. And I used psychedelics when I was a teenager in high school and early college. And then I didn't I didn't take anything for several years. Then I got invited to come to a Santo Daime ceremony. And Santo Daime is this Christian religion that's very sexually gender norms, and they have a special section for virgins and a special section for married women, and men and women do not interact during the ceremony. It's only at the end you can go talk to the people who are male. And homosexuality is not a part of that religion. And also like transgender is not a part of that religion. It's only recently like started to be an issue in the church of people who are transgender, like where are they going to stand in the church, like what are they going to wear, because we wear uniforms. So this, my like reintroduction into psychedelics was in this very intense ayahuasca church, which the ceremonies last for like 12 hours. It's super intense and very different than a lot of people's like experience with psychedelics, especially with like clinical stuff with a mask on and lying down. Like this is dancing for hours. And I had gone to Brazil. I drank once and then I went to Brazil. So I didn't understand. I don't speak Portuguese. I didn't understand what people were saying. I didn't understand what the music was, what, you know, and it was overwhelming and I felt super out of place. But in another way, that's very liberating because I didn't know what they were talking about. Nobody could understand me. I was just like, it was a strange experience that, I mean, it's lasted, I'm still a member of Santo Daime, but I went through a period like of being a Christian and joining like full on participant of that religion. And I still, like I said, I still practice it, but then I went to shamans who were Shipibo shamans and had really intense experiences, like way more intense than Santo Daime, that were healing for me. But just very recently, I went to an ayahuasca retreat like 2 months ago, and I had all this like download about the patriarchy, and the Santo Daime is very much a patriarchal religion, and we even like give vivas to the patriarchs, and it creates this, I don't know, a strange dichotomy for me of being like in this super Christian ritual religion that I mean, we go like twice a month, well, not now because of COVID, but in the past, and to have my homosexual identity, which I must say in California is completely not an issue. Nobody cares, you know, my friends are there and we all like each other and stuff, but it's just a strange place to be, from like feeling weird as a child, feeling weird as a lesbian without knowing I was a lesbian for many years, and then joining this weird religion within which I am also considered weird. So I'm weird from people looking at me from the outside, and I'm weird from the people in my religion. But it's funny because it's a comfortable place for me to be. I think I'm just used to being weird. So
I'd love to come back to that, just what we understand by weird. And yeah, I feel that way too. Yeah, there's something beautiful about embracing that. Terence, don't want to put you on the spot. Did you have anything in mind that you were thinking of sharing? Thank you so much, Clancy.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Clancy. So I identify as a cisgender gay male. And what I didn't list in my bio is that I'm from Singapore. I'm now based in the United States. I'm a permanent resident. I married my husband, was an American citizen here. But coming from Singapore is an interesting place to be queer, because there are explicit laws that are really archaic and just explicitly prohibit sexual intercourse between two men. And they don't have a parallel law for other genders. But I think it really sets the tone coming from that country to the United States. And I think it was a period of transition for me to really come into my own as a gay male. And my experience was with MDMA, and this was in an above ground open label trial, part of the MAPS MDMA therapist training program. So it was a huge privilege to be able to take a psychedelic in an above ground way. And in my experience, there was just so much happening in my experience. But if I had to describe it with one word, I think it would be an unshackling of things that held me back. from being my true self. I've always had the sense that, I know I'm gay and there's nothing to be ashamed about it, but there are just external factors that stop you from being your genuine self. To the point where, it wasn't so much internalized, but you kind of lose hope for a future where you could be married to someone of the same gender, right? Like, to throw out an example out there. But it was really like a powerful experience for me. Unshackling is an understatement. I really came into my own body, into my own identity, feeling really comfortable being who I am. I think that offered me the opportunity to be my real self to the people that mattered to me, to the point where it allowed them to get to know the real me and love me for who I really am, both my family and my friends.
Awesome. Thanks, Terence. Wonderful. So we are now officially in riffing mode. So for panelists, we have permission just to riff with each other. Really awesome to get that personal context for all of you. Thank you. And I think a good place to start, if anyone would like to just talk about what do you understand by this concept of kind of queer psychedelics, or even queering psychedelics, like the book you mentioned, Clancy. How can we kind of conceptualize that basic intersection?
I guess to me, like, the word queer is I wouldn't say loaded, but it has depth. It feels like an umbrella term for a lot of things. It has a course of evolution through its time in language, how it was used as a derogatory term to how it's been, I guess, reclaimed as a signifier of pride. To me personally, and I can only speak to myself, the word queer really means to be outside of the box, outside of these stories that we hear, outside of the possible futures we see for ourselves. And I think we're stepping outside of that because there is a lot of space outside of these boxes that we occupy. So to be queer means for me to step outside of the box, to be different, if that's where it feels comfortable.
Yeah, specifically though, it's about sexuality. So it's like a little bit more dangerous than just wearing a weird outfit or having a funny whatever. It's like people are uncomfortable about sexuality. And when you say queer, it's like when I hear someone identify as that, and I have clients that I would never have thought would think of themselves as queer, but who identify as that because it feels better to them than the other options. So I think it's a brave thing for people because people don't want to hear about sexuality. Like, I think the general public finds mentions of anything besides heterosexuality to be like eyebrow raising. And so I am happy to hear when people who I wouldn't think are queer say that they're queer, because maybe they don't feel so feminine enough to be in the category of female the way that we think of it, or maybe they like have desires for the same sex even though they're married to the opposite sex or something like that. But I think that's definitely been, and I have to confess that I do live in San Francisco, so my views are probably somewhat shaded by that, but that people have been much more like understanding that being locked into these like heterosexual roles is confining, and just to say that you're queer, it can cause people to just wonder like, well, what is queer about you? And it's an interesting fact, and it's related to your sexuality, and it's brave to say anything about that.
I love that, Clancy. And I feel like, what's the key that opens that door or opens that box? When I think about what it is to be queer. I feel like being queer fundamentally involves actively engaging in how we love each other and how we love ourselves. And in that sense, you know, not to paint everybody with the same brush, but like, aren't we all kind of queer? Isn't that fundamental to the human experience? And, you know, queerness for me, I feel like it's a way into love in an incredibly diverse and open and accepting way that I feel really excited about, and hope that others feel excited about it too. I love your example that, you know, people who you wouldn't necessarily label as queer will label themselves as queer. And I feel that opens up so much possibility, because for me, queerness is about how we love ourselves and each other. And I do think that being queer and identifying as queer, you do commit to that understanding of self and of love. You have to ask so many questions about who you are, about what you want, which sounds simple, but for those of us who aren't used to wanting things freely, that's really hard. You know, some of those very basic ways of being with self and being with others. And I'm excited. There's a really cool Indigenous researcher here in Canada named John Burroughs, who talks a lot about, he's a human rights lawyer actually, and he talks a lot about love as a public good. And I also think that queerness is a public good. I think we can be talking more about these things, bringing them, love and queerness, into our conversations at the policy level in, you know, different ways in different spaces, because I do think that they are concepts that get tamped down or that people feel uncomfortable about, but open up such possibility. And for me, that's what I really love about queerness, and that connection to love as the key that opens some of those doors.
Yeah, I love everyone's answers. Yeah, I enjoy queer conversations and queer exploration. And I too have noticed, and I'm sure we've all seen statistics of like younger generations identifying as queer at a much, proportionately really high. And I like to think like, yeah, queerness is such a human experience at the root of it. And I like to explore with people like their queerness. Like, oh, are you like 100% straight, like 100%? And if someone's like, well, not like 100%, like, okay, so like you're a little queer, like explore that for me, and like to ask the questions and get them to explore, like, you know, that 1% or that 5%. It just leads to such beautiful conversation and exploration. And I like to not have any barriers to queerness. It's something that you can opt into if that feels right for you.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm really enjoying love being a big part of this conversation. And in a sense, what Terence started off talking about was around that kind of unshackling, kind of letting go of that which is not love. So in a sense, it's like, well, who am I, and where, you know, what is there if I go deep inside? And it can be quite scary to go deep inside, because there are some things there that are not love. But I feel like one of the similarities between psychedelics and queerness is that journey towards love and insistence on feeling more love for oneself, and to receive from others and to share with others. So beautiful to feel into that. One question I wanted to kind of tack on to where we're coming here is, what other similarities are there around psychedelics and queerness? I'm just going to keep using the word queerness as a catch-all for everything we're talking about, if that's okay. It's not perfect, but I'll run with it. So what other similarities are there? So with psychedelics, we've got this idea of neuroplasticity, and we've all seen that kind of MRI scan, you know, the graphical expression of it with all the different parts of the brain, you know, firing up. And in a sense, I feel like our experience of queerness is a little bit like that. Yes, one with the rainbow thread kind of crisscrossing, but also the different parts of us that we often leave behind. and don't have love to. And I've got a sense of the expansiveness and the liberation, the authenticity, the revelation that we can get from psychedelics. We can also get simply from embracing who we are as a queer person and kind of belonging in that just reality. So what ideas have you folks got around similarities between experiences of psychedelics and using those intentionally and the journey of exploring queer sexual and gender identity?
Well, you're talking about self-love, I think, and like being a therapist and working with people who are using psychedelics, the I don't know, the two things that there's self-love and there's shame, and those two things have to be resolved. And one has to love oneself, and in order to do that, that like clearing out that shame just being like there's something wrong with me. And I think like in our culture, queer people are going to come to that conclusion when they look around and say something and have everyone notice that they're, or wearing a necklace for a boy, or, doing something. We get immediate feedback about in our culture about what if that's okay or not, especially when we're young, and that causes shame because we don't understand it. And I think psychedelics are the key to unlocking, being able to clear out that shame. So in that way, I think they have an interlocking reason. Like gay people often feel shame about their orientation until they are, adults and go through therapy and all kinds of things. And psychedelics can help. I don't know if I'm really addressing your question, how they're the same, but I guess I'm just noting how they work together with like queerness and psychedelics. Like it's a natural thing to like take the veils off your eyes to see who you really are. And then you can understand that there's nothing wrong with you. And when you like come down from your trip, of course, you're not all cured. Well, some people are, but often you're not all cured, but you have that knowledge. You've seen that light, your own light, and that really helps like accept yourself and have a better life.
Beautiful.
So I know that's not your question.
That's it. Yeah. Thanks, Clancy.
I have a response, and I think, this is going to be like a very cognitively taxing thing for me to say, and it has to do with like your previous question as well, David. But hearing everyone's responses, like queerness now also to me feels like a place of like critical self-examination and self-exploration by circumstance. So if you imagine a hypothetical world where being queer, if that's the umbrella term, was status quo, right? Like was the default, then the critical self-examination that us queer people have had to undertake in our lives, we would see that with straight people. We would see them trying to carve out a deeper understanding of who they are and their place in the world, while we queer people would have these scripts already for us, these social scripts that we follow, not really like examining like what's there to being human. And I see psychedelics as like this tool almost, or this vehicle of deeper self-exploration, of unearthing things that are dormant in your consciousness. And you see all these clinical trials and therapeutic studies. Psychedelics are helpful for depression, for PTSD, etc., because they unearth some. They evoke a state of neuroplasticity, and they unearth some psychological tools that may be helpful for navigating a particular condition, etc. It's this process of like deep self-exploration that feels very similar between the the psychedelic experience and the queer experience, because we've had to really dig deep to claim our place in this world. We deserve to be here. And I think that's all part of being human, because we're humans too, and we deserve to be here. But somehow we've had to justify it to other people along the way. So I don't know if that's like, that makes sense to people, but that's what's really calling to me at this moment.
It makes sense to me, Terence. You talked about, a world where everyone's kind of queer. And to your question, David, about how do we want to see these things evolve? I was thinking back to one of my favorite sci-fi dystopian book series where a lot of the characters are queer. It's in the future, but they're not labeled queer. They just are. They're human. They're characters in the book, and then you're like, oh, she's in love with her. I guess she's like a lesbian or queer, but those words aren't used. It's not even addressed. They just are who they are. And the book doesn't make a big deal about it. And pretty much all the characters are queer in the way that we think about them. I love that kind of frame of thinking of oh yeah, maybe as things evolve, I think it's really cool that we have a lot of labels to describe specific attractions and identities and things. But the more psychedelic experiences I have, sometimes I wonder, maybe we'll get to a point in our human evolution where we actually don't really need the terms anymore at some point one day, where everyone is queer, human, and we go through phases maybe of being hetero for periods and phases of not, and our constructs of gender are loosened up, and that to me seems like a world that I kind of want to live in.
You imagine the end of the patriarchy.
Fair.
Sorry to say that, but
I know. That's why it's a science fiction.
That's why
we'll need the labels for a good while.
Well.
Yeah.
Because there's something about doing your own inner work and then returning home, back to your job, back to family and friends and paying bills, and the world hasn't changed. Your neighbors are still your neighbors, and you still got to wake up in the morning and brush your teeth. So it does feel like there's room here for our personal unshackling and self-love to perhaps catalyze a collective unshackling and collective love and acceptance of all in a more kind of meta queer reality. One of those realms that we can kind of expedite and catalyze that is through policy. And so I want to have a question here for everyone. When we think about being queer, in the past, that was not allowed. In a lot of countries, it still isn't. We're just talking about Singapore. And there's other parts of America. If I go to upstate New York, it's totally different to where I live here. It's really different. You wouldn't be able to have a queer pride rainbow flag there. So it's really different. So in the past, when it has been illegal, well, a lot of queer people were still queer. They didn't say, oh, okay, I'll just stop being me and forget about that. Yeah, there were still some in those days that unfortunately did repress that. But I think there's been just an undercurrent of resistance and fighting against the unjust laws. And I also believe, is the second part to what I'm saying, around psychedelics and the war on drugs. Those are unjust laws. Firstly, just looking at the way that psychedelics, mushrooms and other plants were taken from where they originated outside of the West, but also just looking at what happened in the 70s, and so many people in jail now for using drugs of all kinds, not just psychedelics, but cannabis and heroin and cocaine and benzos, so all of these things. So how do we understand policy, and what are the experiences of queer people resisting laws and policies that do not serve them, that are not just? And how does that potentially connect with the right to liberty of mind and consciousness, and using psychedelics and drugs to heal. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Feel free to riff. What comes up for you folks?
The one thing I have is when there's a will, there's a way. And that is so flippant now that I'm thinking about it, because there are so many risks that come with resisting the structures that govern your body, essentially, and what you want to do to it and how you want to express it.
It's crazy the religious right and this movement to have people have more permission to like refuse to bake cakes for gay weddings and stuff like that is also a force that is helping ayahuasca churches get a foot in the door and claim that religion is starting to trump other things in a much more serious way. Like now it's abortion, and it's, the Supreme Court is offering more support and privilege for religions. And so I'm in an ayahuasca religion and they're all like, yay, they're not going to be able, they're doing this over here, so then they must do that over here for us. I mean, it's probably a bone that they are willing to throw in order to, have it be so one-sided for religious right. But I mean, it's kind of weird to feel, that the theocracy is helping the ayahuasca churches. Those, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of confusion about who can be called a church and what beliefs they must have, and et cetera, and all the court cases that are being done around, like Soul Quest Church and other churches that are trying to become recognized. But it does feel weird that that particular policy, with those horrible people that are making it, whose goal is not to have people drink ayahuasca or take peyote or anything like that, but we kind of are going to get shuffled in according to their rules to have the freedom to do. I think it will result in more freedom for people to practice their, medicine-based religions. So that's a bright spot, maybe.
Thanks, Clancy. Anyone else get anything from that rambling question of mine?
Well, it's interesting when I think about sort of, the legal and regulatory frameworks and landscape, or when you think about policy and how we make policy, not to take us too far off, but so much of what laws are and what policy is about stories. It's about who's telling the stories. It's about who's the hero. It's about who's being protected. There's a whole narrative around how we construct society and who we demonize and what we demonize. And I'm interested in, we Terence and I have actually been working together a bit on a scoping review, looking at, the scope of research. You mentioned conversion therapy and some of the harms that have been done and some of the fear that's just baked into how society thinks about queerness. And some of that is commission. So it's doing terrible things, and that continues to happen. But it's also omission, and it's not featuring, not thinking about, not focusing on, not creating space for these different ways of being. And we've seen this in the research space quite a bit. In the scoping review, we found, aside from Clancy's thesis, there is virtually nothing written in the psychedelic literature about queerness. Ram Dass has written some stuff, Clancy did, Terence did a beautiful article on his experiences, but there really is almost nothing about queerness in research and in peer-reviewed sources. And And that's the sort of basis. That omission, I think, speaks volumes because, you know, policy is built on research, is built on what we know. And research is storytelling. It again highlights what's important, who's telling the stories, etc. And so some of the things we have observed in the research and in the literature, I think maps onto this larger question around laws and fear and how we govern ourselves and each other. And I'm interested, you know, in the literature, for example, if there is any mention of queerness and psychedelics, the conflation is, it focuses almost exclusively on cis gay men and on the rave scene and MDMA use, and problematizes both. So basically that's the only narrative that we have. There's no examination or thinking about the qualitative experiences of why people were taking MDMA and how they experienced that. It was just that they were taking it. It was prevalence. And there's a whole world of experience of queerness and psychedelics that we have yet to unpack and understand through stories and have that trickle up into how we think about and construct and regulate ourselves around as the legalization process and the decriminalization process unfolds. I think there's real opportunity to center different voices, center different stories, and be conscious and intentional about who's given the microphone and whose stories we're telling. So that's sort of what I was thinking about a bit with that question.
I'll riff on that a little bit, Amy. I'm actually excited about drug policy for once. If you look back in America anyway, right, looking back a few decades, so much of drug policy was formed by people who didn't like drugs. What I've been noticing, and especially in the conversations at work at MAPS, are the people that are writing the policy are actually like, they like drugs, and they actually are like, what a nice change to have people forming policy that are actually putting in harm reductionist approaches, or you're thinking about how do we implement this in a safe, responsible, ethical way. And it's going to be hard, but at least there's an opening to have the right people telling those stories. And so I'm hopeful, skeptical and hopeful, cautiously optimistic, that hopefully we can get some more queer people into these spaces to help draft some of these policies as well.
It reminded me of when they were giving permission for the ayahuasca churches in Brazil to use ayahuasca. They had, initially it was illegal, and they invited, and these politicians went, newspaper reporters and like people in the government went and participated and drank the ayahuasca to see if it was like bad or good. And that's one of the main reasons that it became legal in Brazil. I can't imagine that happening in the United States, but it's a great, like, try it, you'll like it. That's what, you know, it's not evil, and not just ayahuasca, but all the psychedelics are not inherently bad. It's just drugs in our culture have such a heavy weight of like criminality that, you know, psychedelics wants to separate themselves out. And, you know, in one way, I totally agree that they're very different than like crack or meth or whatever. But, you know, I still am anti-prohibitionist as far as like putting people in jail for using drugs, but they are like helpful to people's growth, and that can be seen if you take them. And from the outside, you know, people aren't even looking on the outside. Like, what would they observe? Someone taking MDMA and sitting on a couch or whatever. You really have to do it yourself to understand. So they could make that a requirement for Congress. I know, and then there's people who, because I've read and worked with enough ayahuasca, like the belief that if everyone just took ayahuasca, or everyone just, you know, took a psychedelic, and then they'd all be at peace. But we can see that from the January 6th what was his name? I can't remember. The shaman with the horns who was promoting ayahuasca use. That, you know, it does not cure people of their misconceptions in all cases.
Yeah, it is not a guarantee of enlightenment using the psychedelics or of anything. It's really good points. I wanted to I think to drill into the part that Stephen, you touched on, and Amy, around research in the psychedelics world. So definitely want to hear about MAP, Stephen. And can we also talk about on the round kind of Jedi diversity inclusion, what wasn't working, what wasn't happening in the world of psychedelic research, and to what extent have things changed now with the questions that are being asked, with the way that research trials are being designed, with the way that participants are coming on board, and who the therapists are. So I think this is going to be a long one, but let's really start unpacking this. So just starting off with where were we with psychedelic research around diversity inclusion? And I know the work of Monica Williams, a few of you have worked with.
I was going to
Dr.
say
Williams as well. So yeah, go ahead.
Maybe Terence and Amy can speak to Dr. Williams's research, because it was that as I was thinking about navigating into the psychedelics space from a career of diversity and inclusion, well, it was Chacruna and it was Dr. Williams's paper that made me think, oh, there is space for me to do this work here.
Nice. Yeah, it's just lovely to say there is space for me. It's such a lovely way of understanding the psychedelic community. That's personally why I definitely love being part of it. Can be a bit more colorful than.
I don't remember the stats off the top of my head, but I think Dr. Williams studied something like the most, the 20-ish something psychedelic studies that had recently been published and looked at the race ethnicity breakdowns, and I think it was something like 90% white. Is that right?
Yeah, and it was highly non-diverse.
Yeah. Terence, that's actually how Terence got connected months ago. It's about like, how did they get 90% white participants at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore? Like, how did that happen? Just like reflecting on like, how did it get this way? And I think the kind of in your face answer is it takes a lot of privilege to be in the psychedelic space. If you think back 10 or 20 years ago, I asked, like, well, how far would MAPS be far along if Rick Doblin was like a Black woman? Like probably not as far along as we were today. Like it just took a lot of privilege to be in that space. So those early, efforts to, enroll people in trials, I'm sure was not easy to find people that are willing to risk their livelihood or their safety to be in one of these trials. But a lot of that is changing, thankfully.
I have so many thoughts around this. Too many to put into this space. But yeah, it's a wonder how these historically Black neighborhoods that surround these premier research institutes, how they don't find their way into the clinical trials. And there are many factors. But having thought about this for the past 6 years and done the research on it, I guess the summary sentiment for me is that researchers need to do better. I think that's period. Like, we need to do better. We have the complete responsibility and onus to bring people into the trial, to modify trials to be more accessible for everyone. And we can't blame, take for example, people of color for being reluctant or unwilling to participate in psychedelic clinical trials because they heard from their neighbors, or they know a neighbor or a family member who was arrested for drug charges. I mean, of course they don't want to come into these trials. But you know, like that's kind of like blaming the victim to me. So I don't want to see researchers play blaming the victim. I want them to do better, and you know, we can always do better. And there are some tried and tested and some ongoing, you know, ways to do better in terms of recruitment in a more culturally sensitive manner. And Dr. Williams talks about it all in few of her publications. I had other thoughts, but I'll leave it at that.
I think, yeah, I think the strength, what I love about this conversation, I think the strength of queerness and thinking about queerness, again, as we've talked about, it's, you know, it's sexuality, it's all those things, but it can be so much broader. And I think inclusion is built into how we can think about queerness and psychedelics, because I think it can open a lot of different doors and bring in a lot of those considerations and intentions that, again, there's been a lot of omission as much as there has been commission. I think, you know, one thing just on the research piece that I'm just throwing out there, I'm really interested, you know, we talked a little bit about research and how it's being done. And, you know, there's lots of things out there that Dr. Williams has been writing, you know, talk about, you know, dismantling the gender binary for dyads when it comes to protocols, even simple things like, you know, and again, Clancy and Alex Belser and people have been writing about this, you know, basic things around intake forms and having different pronouns and just sort of basic inclusion things that haven't been included. I'm also interested in, and maybe I'll just throw it out there for consideration, I'm also interested in, you know, when we say research, it doesn't have to just be clinical trials and investigations undertaken in an academic context. Psychedelics have a long history of self-experimentation, you know, Anne Shulgin, the Shulgins, and, you know, formal and informal investigation, experimentation. I'm interested in, you know, again, the intersection of queerness and psychedelics and of intersectionality and diversity. Part of it, I think we have to come up from both sides. One is, you know, forcing inclusion. We need representation. We need to be here. We need to be considered. I'm also interested in the other side of that coin is like, let's research stuff ourselves and create spaces and do things, do research to, again, create those stories, create those narratives, create that evidence, and bring those voices into these spaces. You know, all of this is very tempered with considerations, obviously, of harm reduction and safety and you know, all these different things. But I'm curious what you folks think. I help run a psychedelic society. I'm really interested in and passionate about grassroots and community, and you know, how people support themselves and each other in these informal ways. And I'm curious what you folks think about, you know, the role of community and of informal research as part of filling the void and bringing the voice that has been absent for a very long time, both from this sort of racial diversity as well as queerness, et cetera.
I want to comment on you're Canadian, and you know Erica Dick, right?
Yes.
She has just, I'm a co-editor of this book, which I had right here, but it's Mujeres y Psychedelicos, it's Women in Psychedelics. Mm-hmm. And she's gone and done like interviews and histories with all these women. She took a trip and she actually stayed at our place, and she was interviewing Kat Harrison, like trying to get these histories from people who have been, especially women who have been very involved, but have been like the wife of somebody. Like the second person to take LSD was, you know, the wife of, and other people who assisted, and Anne Shulgin, of course, all these people who, just because they're like women and put into a secondary role, their contributions have been forgotten. And I don't know if there's a similar queer group of people that need to be reported on or whatever, but there is a lot that gets missed. And it's interesting because I went to the Alcohol and Drug History Society annual conference in Mexico City where Erica was presenting, and we launched that book. And just like, I think I'm going to join that society. It's so interesting, the stuff we don't know about, like drugs and alcohol, even, like just fascinating, unknown stuff that you have to be such a nerd to like seek out and learn about. So I'm all in favor of finding the underground histories that if we don't catch them, you know, the people who did that will pass on, and that information won't be available.
I love that. And I think about, you know, the psychedelic revival that we're in. And, you know, I think about, you know, the Michael Pollan stuff. I haven't seen the newest thing. Everyone's very excited. We get so many people joining our integration circles lately, in part brought in by that. So there's a lot of interest. But to your point, Clancy, you know, even in this moment when we're having more awareness about the importance of intersectionality and inclusion and these sorts of things, but it's still a lot of like the grandfathers. People are still referring to the same people. It's still Stan Groff and James Fadiman and, you know, Michael Pollan is the new person, but it's still a lot of white dudes, you know? And so I'm really interested in what you're talking about too. I'm curious how do we get more of the others we are the majority, but how do we get more of those people recognized and in the spaces? Because, you know, you know about it, I know about it, but like the guy who just joined our integration circle definitely does not.
Well, the book just came out.
Yeah, it's a
gonna
really good, sorry, Clancy. It's a really good conversation that I think is worth having about like the mainstreaming of psychedelics and how we do that. I have to be careful what I can say here, because as a MAPS employee, you know, I have to say the FDA is the only parameter, you know, the only arbiter of safety. And but speaking personally, as Stephen, it is interesting to see how psychedelics are used in more like social contexts, and it gets me thinking about how the way people learn about psychedelics will not be reading about clinical trials. It is important to diversify these clinical trials, but it's also, when we think about the ethical growth of psychedelics, they'll be hearing about Aaron Rodgers, they'll be hearing about, you know, different cultural people, icons experiencing it. And that's probably what's going to change perception more than, you know, like MAPS is doing a lot to diversify our clinical trials, but like how many people actually know that or will pay attention to that? Unfortunately, not as many people as I would like. But like if LeBron James talked about how he did ayahuasca and, you know, had the best season of his NBA career, I think that would do so much more. And so I think kind of the growth edge for psychedelics may be a cultural movement that, yeah, is not going to be in our trials, represented in our trials.
It's interesting. They focus on veterans, like MAPS very strongly focused on, and it's like to get sympathy, and nobody can want to deny a veteran like something that will help them, and so that's how they're opening the doors in that way. And I'm sure veterans do have horrible PTSD, but like other groups like African Americans and queer people and transgender people have very traumatic lives often. And like if we're giving it out or prioritizing who needs it, veterans are a good group, but so are people who like or have been cast aside or, you know, treated horribly and have, you know, you can see the rates of alcohol and drug use among queer people is higher, and suicide among, transgender people, and murders among transgender people. It's like a highly stigmatized group. And another thing about queer people is that we're born into, we don't have solidarity in our homes because our parents usually aren't queer, and we have to like go outside of our family and go outside of the comfort of wherever that we're from, and join with people that we don't know who are also, it's just super stressful. And I'm hoping that can be recognized as a sort of prioritization and reaching out to queer people who have a lot of mental health problems because of the way that they're treated by our culture.
Maybe now's a good time to ask, we've spoken about, questions and protocols and to increase the inclusivity of queer folks in trials, or just to make treatment, therapy more accessible. Do you have any other really tangible, solutions? I'll use the word, tangible kind of solutions that, if they were implemented on a more of a healthcare systems level, that would really make mental health treatment more accessible to queer folks. Having worked in psychiatry and addiction for so long, I'm really aware of the cultural lens through which we see reality, and how norms can be reinforced kind of unconsciously as well as consciously, that makes accessing treatment just not an option. Just people don't feel safe, they don't belong there, it just doesn't feel right. And there's often, in most places in the world, just not an LGBTQ center where they can access that. So in Manhattan and other places there are, but most of the world there aren't those special places where queer people can go to get treatment, particularly for them. So what kind of solutions or ideas have we got to make just general healthcare, medicine and mental health care more accessible, to feel more akin and easier to kind of walk into and feel like, I feel safe, I want to do this?
Just to float, we talk about this a little bit, but as we talked about at the beginning of our chat today, and we launched with some personal encounters with ourselves and with psychedelics and with queerness. And, there's lots of ways that psychology can be done that dismantle the hierarchy and power imbalance between therapist and client, for example. So things like functional analytics and psychotherapy, where there's mutual vulnerability and there's a relationship of trust that's built on understanding and knowing each other. And again, not to be a broken record, but love is part of the conversation. So there's ways, I think, to do psychology and do therapy with vulnerable groups that dismantle some of the power structures that are built into our medical system, that I think can be exciting. The other thing, again, just to pitch, not to pitch, but I also think that, when we think about the community of care, as we're bringing psychedelics into the mainstream, quote unquote, thinking about the community of care that we need to provide to people as people move into a psychedelic healing journey, there's the medical system, in my view, there's the medical system, but this is a pyramid, and the vast majority of people have in the past, are currently having, and will continue to have experiences outside of the medical model, and the support that they receive will be community-based and peer-based. And again, we need to have the systems in place for people who need more support and more help and et cetera, 100%. But there is a pyramid, and there's this big chunk that we're not talking about, that I'm passionate about, of peer support and community building. And again, thinking about what queer people need and what marginalized people need. We need each other. And there's a big chunk of society that I think we can organize and empower and enable to be able to find each other and support each other in this work and in these spaces. So I think there's system level stuff that we can do, but I also think I'm interested in an inclusive community of care that isn't just about the medical system and embraces how people have been using these medicines for a long time, which includes spirituality and religious institutions, but also each other. Again, but also harm reduction is super important, creating safe spaces, making sure people, how do we treat each other well and respectfully? And, there's a lot of complications there, but I think for me, that's something I'm really excited about. And I think there's potential there.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's true. Most people are going to take drugs on their own and not in a hospital and not with a therapist. And it's still going to be expensive, and people can't afford like regular therapy, let alone like psychedelic therapy. It's interesting what they're doing in Oregon to have just facilitators trained to, and that's really like when I did the training on how to sit for somebody doing psilocybin, it was basically like you sit there and you don't really need to be like a great therapist or whatever to sit with somebody who's tripping. And I think that do it yourself, like there are people who shouldn't take drugs, and I hope that they get screened out when possible. But like, I really think that the hope is, and also the fact that mushrooms, which is what is, they grow so easily, they can be grown by anybody at home. It's like, they're basically free. You don't need to have a, doctor there to administer them or anything. So I think that is really the hope of like why God put all these substances like right in our hands. Like we're not supposed to take them and hand them to a doctor so they can give it back to us. It's just really people who are not like psychotic. Okay, I'll make that caveat, but should be allowed to help themselves if they want to help themselves. I mean, ask their friends to like sit and read a book or whatever while they're tripping if they feel like they don't want to be alone. But it's not necessary to have these highly trained, I think, and I'm a psychologist, and I'm highly trained, and I know that in talk therapy I do think it helps to be a good therapist or whatever. But for psychedelic trip, I mean, integration is important. But yeah, I think you're right about the community thing, and also talking about how gay people, queer people have used psychedelics in the past in underground contexts or in huge parties, or we talk about this one maypole ceremony that apparently has been taking place with hundreds of people every year that we don't, with queer people someplace, I don't know, but there's stuff we don't know about because who's going to talk about it? And it's groups of people trying to get better with each other instead of seeking a medical doctor. And that's what's necessary, because it's just going to be too expensive, even if they lower the price and even if insurance covers it.
So we have a load of questions. So I'm going to ask a few of those, but before we jump into those audience questions, I wanted to ask, right now in the psychedelic renaissance, and I'm not a big fan of that word, there's, a land grab and intellectual property comes out, what everyone's trying to get IP over. The way that we're talking here about what queer people are doing in the real world, and they have been doing for years, in a sense, that sounds like intellectual property, or it sounds like real world innovation that works, that feels right. So I'm wondering, like, if we were able to kind of extrapolate those protocols, that set and setting, that feel of what people are doing in the underground, that have been doing for a long time, in groups or sitting and guiding for each other, I wonder what kind of value that would have if it was given freely, about these are things that work, and how could that be put into maybe a training program of these are top 10, or these are some of the things to keep in mind that help queer folks just feel safe. Because to me that sounds like real like intellectual property that exists, that belongs to everybody because people are doing it already.
You know, Brian Anderson, a psychiatrist at UCSF, did a study with gay men who had HIV, but got it during the main part of the AIDS epidemic, but outlived all of their friends and had like survivor guilt. They were depressed. I mean, I don't think everybody that outlived their friends, but the group that you worked with. And one of the things that they did was to do group therapy. That people would take. They didn't do the substance in a group, but they would come together afterwards and do group therapy. And I think I would go further and have people do the substance in groups. Like that's a traditional, like indigenous way of doing it, is to have groups of people who all, and ayahuasca retreats are like that. You all take it and then you all like bond and talk about what you learned and help each other. And like ayahuasca retreats I've been on, they always have like a group that, you know, you stay in touch on the internet and you talk about things. And some, for years I've had some people that I've corresponded with. And I think like having people, like groups of queer people doing it all together is how we're supposed to take drugs. So, you know, not with a doctor, I mean, a doctor can be there or whatever, but I think there's a lot to be gained from like solidarity with other people who you could trust and who are similar to you in like who are queer and understand the difficulties of that, and would open up make it more easy to talk about what happened if you feel more comfortable with that group. So, and that's also be a cost saver because groups are cheaper than individual.
Yeah, there is this huge problem of affordability. So again, I have to like, you know, say my MAPS thing, and that like the medical route is great for reducing risks in certain circumstances, and it's better for some people. But I really hope that the medical route does not take over any space that exists for the underground or community use or the religious and ceremonial use. I personally believe that there's space for all of these groups to exist. Speaking personally, I'm a big fan of the group experience and the group processing. I have done a queer group and I've done a mixed group, and I actually thought the most helpful thing was actually more for the mixed group, the really super diverse group with lots of different people and experiences, people that I disagree with politically, to be able to talk about their experience and my experience and integrate with them and be like, oh, I actually like see this humanity in you and this like other side that I've villainized for so long. And it turns out they also love me. So then I don't like, it's like, oh, like I feel less othered when I'm actually really in a beautifully diverse group and lots of parallel and lots of kind of like axes. And when I'm able to do psychedelics in that group setting, more affordable, and to me more enriching.
Maybe I'll just jump in. There's a few questions that are all saying similar things around whether or not to have kind of queer only spaces, either physically, in personal, or virtual. And that's kind of what you're talking about there, you know, the pros and cons of it. And it doesn't have to be there's just one, obviously, it's not that binary thing. We're talking about there being, you know, a spectrum. But can anyone speak to the different experiences you've had, or knowing, you know, how people that you've worked with professionally, what are some of their experiences around whether to be in a kind of open space where different folks are going to be there, or just to be in a queer space? And particularly a couple of other people have asked, 2 or 3 people, around doing medicine work itself and the extra vulnerability that comes up in extraordinary states of consciousness, and how much more triggering that could be with more transference and counter-transference, you know, working with those folks. So yeah, what are some of our thoughts there? It's going to be a non-binary answer, I know.
Yeah, Stephen, like I love that you were able to have those experiences, like with a mixed group and with a queer only group. and if I'm being honest, when I heard you talk about your experiences in the mixed group, my initial like automatic reaction is like, oh, like uh, I don't want to be in that group. If I took MDMA and I had to talk about my experiences, but you know, like that just speaks to the diversity of personal preferences, like where you are in your life, how you've evolved through your identity, how comfortable are you in your identity at this point in time. And if you asked me like 5 years ago and maybe 5 years from now, I could have vastly different answers to whether I prefer a mixed group or like a queer only group or just a group full of gay men, or just, you know, like I'm the only gay man in the group full of trans folks and gay women, and you know, like just, you know, it's gonna depend on how I feel in this time, what I'm working on, what I'm working through, and how much I want to share. You know, like the idea of safe spaces is that I guess the aspirational quality of a safe space is that everyone feels safe enough to say what they truly feel and have the assumption that they will be received supportively. Of course, some safe spaces aren't always that safe. When microaggressions creep in, when automatic biases creep in. So I think it really is a case by case basis, you know, like, you know, working with your client and making sure that, you know, you're kind of like talking about these really important things to make some collaborative decisions about, you know, how you want to integrate your psychedelic experiences afterwards. Do you want to do it just with me in a group? You know, if you have the luxury of offering options, I think that's a wonderful way to customize it to the person.
My mixed group did have a discussion before, which I was like, around divine feminine and divine masculine. And I'm fine with those terms, but like the microaggressions creep in and people like associate masculinity with being a man and femininity with being a cis woman. And like there was that stuff. And I had to like pull the facilitator aside and be like, I think you need to like do that a little bit differently. And, you know, I felt comfortable being this person who works in the space to do that. But, you know, 2 people in my group had recently come out as gay and they were both married with kids. And I'm like, that was probably kind of harmful for them. Like you have to watch out and create that, hold that container carefully. And I think there is a risk of, doing some harm for people that are exploring their sexuality if it really is in a like really straight space.
I know that women's, like I've been to women only psychedelic events that are like very different than mixed ones, and I'm sure men only groups are very different than women only groups. So but I've never been to like a psychedelic ritual that was all gay people, and I would like to, because I don't know how that would be, or all lesbians. Maybe that would be even harder group to get together, but I think it would be interesting. It's just hard to find like that group. It's even difficult to find women's groups or find women's retreats, although they're much more common than like a les retreat. Maybe I had thought of like trying to do an ayahuasca retreat and bring people to a center, like all gay people or all queer women or something, but it's a lot of work, so I haven't done it.
Well, like you say, it's sort of finding each other. I still, you know, we're slowly finding. I'm curious what you folks think. I'm still finding queer people. I'm still like, who are my peeps? It's just been a slow process of figuring out how to be myself and be open about, like, to raise that flag, and then to sort of like find that flag with other people as well. You know, I've been running, I do think it's a question of additionality in having both. I've been running the integration circles for our community now for over 3 years, and they've always been mixed. And I've thought a lot about having a women's group or having a queer group, but I just don't, I don't think I should try it, but I feel like we're not going to get enough people, or it's not going to be as attended. It's tough. There's a volume question and accessing those people to let them know that this is happening question, that I'm still confused about how we find each other.
I'm wondering if you try it, Amy, and like you're thinking, oh, there's not enough like, you know, queer people in my group, but maybe they're waiting for you to form this queer only space for you to join, and they're avoiding the mixed group. So
it's a very good question. Yeah.
Right?
Maybe I should try it. We do everything on Zoom right now. I just see that comment. So everyone is welcome. We have people from the States coming up as well for ours. But just to say too, just in terms of having the both, I will say, you know, I've also worked with queer people and also people who don't identify as queer, but in our conversations and in their experiences have sort of found that in themselves. And I don't think, you know, those private, intimate spaces can be important for a person finding themselves as well. So I'm interested in the group pieces. I'm also interested in those private, intimate places where people can really find themselves and then move into the public, which I think is interesting.
You know, there's so much activity in the chat. It's amazing. And I think, you know, I feel really called to just address the fact that we were, you know, recruited for this panel is because we have like a presence on the internet, and we have the privilege of occupying professional roles in this space as they intersect with psychedelics and queerness. But the truth is, like, we are not arbiters of what it means to be queer and engaging in the psychedelic space. I feel like we need to state that because there's so much going on in the chat. It's obvious that people are queer and are using psychedelics and have so much wealth of wisdom to share. I don't know, it's up to you, David, but I feel like now could be a really good time to maybe have people ask questions, maybe share a little bit, like to just, you know, even out the field a little bit, make it less hierarchical. I feel like, I don't know what people think, but I've been looking at it and it's like, yeah, like I wonder if there's a queer group.
This is cool. Oh, I'm just opening up the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that idea. I really do. Thanks for so much for saying that, Terence. So I've just messaged Mel. I'm not sure how to unmute you. Let's see how to do that because you've got a question there. I'm not sure if Monica, if you're able to help. Maybe I just have to go to participants.
Trying to do it. Allow to talk. I think we're good.
Okay, Mel, thanks for your question. If your mic should be on if you want to ask the panel.
Okay. Thank you for letting me ask the question. I was starting to familiarize myself with kind of just the history of psychedelics with the queer community and with queer and trans folks, and it's a complicated history, and there's been a lot of harms perpetuated. So some of it makes me nervous just in terms of, you know, with the kind of exploding of research happening now. I know it hasn't really stopped, right? A lot of it went underground, but with this reemergence happening right now, that without really talking about that and really being aware of that, and more of all of us being involved in the research process, that will continue. Like those harms will be kind of perpetuated again. And so seeing some of the research and like case studies being put out kind of brought that concerns up for me. Even something like in 2019, I saw, you know, a case study that was put out. And so just if any of y'all can speak to just, you know, what your thoughts are on that, or if you know, if like who are folks in the field doing research that are bringing that history and awareness to the work, or yeah, just that's my question.
I can definitely put a plug in for Christopher Stauffer, who is a psychiatrist at Oregon State University, doing remarkable work with MDMA and psilocybin for various indications. And one of the things or projects that their group is working on right now is developing the protocol for a group treatment using MDMA for trans folks. And I think that's the first of its kind. I think much of the protocol will likely borrow from what Clancy mentioned before for the group treatment study using psilocybin for long-term AIDS survivors. I think they might borrow some elements of that into the MDMA format or setting for trans folks. So that's really encouraging to me, and I've been just waiting for someone to like really take the lead on that, and you know, like knowing that the group has a history in working with sexually and gender diverse folks makes me feel like really heartened to see like, you know, I really hope that this will come true for them, that they will be able to do that study. And I can paste a link to his website as well.
We're really pushing people to start capturing the sexual orientation of the participants in their trials. So before it was like, yeah, we captured some gender stuff, but it's like barely gets a mention. You know, we're now encouraging people to capture gender identity, the sexual orientation, the race, ethnicity, to put that in the report to add some credibility, to say, hey, is this study generalizable across different populations? Brian Anderson's and Chris Stouffer's studies are doing that. The research around using ayahuasca to address the Israeli-Palestinian conflict had a non-binary participant. And like the first time I saw that, I was like, like we do exist, you know. And the more that we can help like push just capturing that data and hopefully making it a criteria in investigator-initiated trials that we sponsor could be how we start to make progress there. Like that does matter, that it should be a part of the clinical trial participant population.
And I will say it because Clancy probably won't, but you know, Chacruna's doing amazing stuff. And you can find a lot of people who are doing work around queerness and psychedelics on their website and with, yeah. So I think that's a good place to go, and there's lots of cool stuff happening in that arena as well.
You're so right.
All right, so I am going to unmute Sasha if you want to, yeah, give it a try to ask you a question.
All right, wonderful. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, hi Sasha.
Terrific. I wanted to start off by thanking Psychedelics Day for hosting this event and all the panelists for their rather thought-provoking and helpful contributions tonight. These sorts of discussions are absolutely necessary for our growing community of researchers and advocates. I want to give everyone a brief introduction as to who I am. My name is Sasha Cisco. I'm a non-binary integration coach, author, freelance journalist, and host of the Ultradelic podcast. I have two brief questions, the first of which deals with issues that potentially border on psychedelic-assisted conversion therapy. Less than 2 weeks ago, people within our research community began calling for, quote, the development of treatment protocols for victims of gender-affirming medicine, end quote. To be specific, Stephanie Wynn shared this thought on Twitter in response to the Biden administration's willingness to prepare for the approval of MDMA therapy. Ronan Levy of Field Trip Health responded to Stephanie's comments by explicitly thanking her. My first question is this: how does the panel feel about Stephanie's calls for the, quote, development of treatment protocols for victims of gender-affirming medicine? And my second question involves misgendering. I'm going to be rather transparent. I have unfortunately been routinely misgendered by certain leaders within our research community, and a number of these individuals refuse to acknowledge this despite being adequately informed on the matter. One in particular is a queer scholar whom we're all familiar with, and I personally respect. My question is this: would anyone on this panel be willing to help me initiate a restorative justice process so that I can once again feel safe and comfortable contributing as a member of this community? Yes.
For saying all that. I honestly am very confused by the first question. And I have no knowledge of the context, and I guess like I'm coming from a place of wondering what Stephanie meant by being victims of gender affirming medicine.
I could actually elaborate on that partially. I can't speak for her. I've consumed a portion of her work, but the idea is this: there are a number of individuals who consider themselves to be victims of gender affirming medicine insofar that they felt as if their therapists had manipulated them into engaging in a process that changed their body in a way that they were ultimately not comfortable with. I think that's a fair description of why Miss Nguyen is advocating for these people. Again, I said that it potentially borders on conversion therapy, because if these substances are misused by therapists who have the wrong intentions, the wrong desires, I feel that there could be a lot of harm created in this space, and I just wanted to put that alert out there that I'm rather concerned about this and where it may head. Obviously, there may be some people who can potentially benefit from such a practice, but again, I feel that it could be misused and abused.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha. So maybe there's a way to speak to both of the questions around what can someone do if they have been treated in a way that is either from a race or a gender sexuality perspective that is unjust or is hurtful, or that is harassing or abusive. So maybe can we just talk about what can people do? Like, are there any mechanisms, codes of conduct, or I know there's no kind of licensing bodies particularly for psychedelic therapists yet, and a couple of them are in the stages of getting up and running in the next year or two. But what's happening at the moment if people do have grievances of abuse, harassment, or being misgendered, as Sasha said? Where would we direct them to, for example? Yeah, so I don't really answer that.
I think it really depends on the context and the nature of the relationship between the person who made, I guess, the remark and the recipient of that remark, or the person who had an experience of feeling offended by the remark. And if it's a professional relationship, there's always room for a detailed conversation about that, and hopefully there are avenues for reparations in that sense, feeling like, okay, this was a rupture and let's work on that. Say this was a therapist who said that to a client. Hopefully the therapist is responsive to the client saying, hey, I feel like you really said something that rubbed me the wrong way, and I feel really unheard, and I feel like you're not hearing me, and you misgendered me, basically. But if we're talking about other relationships, I think it depends on a lot of different things as well, and might be really hard to get the sense of reconciliation outside of a professional relationship. but I think, you know, I need more context to really weigh in on this, unfortunately.
I might sort of add, I'm in Canada, so I don't have my finger on the pulse of how the access to opportunities in the States, or the situation that you just described, Sasha, with your president. But what I will say, and what it sort of tweaked for me, is, you know, I'm really glad that you brought it up, and again, sort of highlighted for me the importance of information sharing and of having these conversations and of talking about the things that are a problem. From what it sounds like, you know, this conversion therapy piece is a very strong part of our collective psychedelic history, and it's not that far away, and it's still kind of present. And we're not learning from our history. We're not bringing those stories and remembering them and avoiding making the same mistakes. So I think it's really, I'm really glad that you brought it up and that we're talking about it, and that we're helping each other and helping the community not make the same mistakes again and again.
Thanks, everybody. And someone else just popped in the chat box that, yeah, misgendering happens often, and even within queer circles, and they often have to challenge it specifically. So yeah, it's really important to put that out there. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left. Feel free if there's any other questions that you want to put out there. Conversion therapy has been mentioned by a few different people, and also this diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And if anyone feels called to speak about these subjects, whether or not they're related or just separately, but it, you know, particularly my personal experiences of working as a therapist with gender dysphoria, to get insurance to cover it, you have to put something down there to treatment. And so often with clients, not that I don't make anything up, you know, because I'd lose my license as a therapist, but you know, the system that we live in means that we have to have some kind of diagnostic code, some kind of pathologizing. So I'm interested, this term, gender dysphoria, how does it make you feel? And how do you feel about it being used as a gateway often for trans people to access services?
I go back to my first use of the term unshackling, is this, the shackles are on, this experience of, and this is coming from working with, so I worked for 2 years in a trans support group, and it's not just exclusively trans, although it's heavily trans-centric in the sense of a lot of the members of our support group identify as trans. There are sexually diverse folks as well. And it's really, you know, really being very clear about why dysphoria happens. And why, when it occurs, it continues to occur, and it's maintained over time by, you know, social structures, scripts, norms that apply pressure for you to appear and express yourself a certain way when it doesn't feel authentic. So I really hear you, David, you know, like from the therapist perspective, you know, a code needs to be applied for you to bill for services. But from the personal perspective, you know, the idea of this as a pathology feels really foreign to me, because there's nothing wrong about not feeling like you're in the right body. But the way to gain some sense of equilibrium about it, some sense of contentedness about it, is fraught in the world that we live in right now with gender affirming procedures, etc.
Thanks, Terence. Anyone else want to add to that? And it's interesting, just as a thought, you know, we were saying at the beginning, just the term queer and queerness has been transformed to some extent, like our understanding of it, like our ownership of it and embodiment of it has changed over the years. So I don't know if that's going to happen with gender dysphoria. I don't think it needs to. My sense is it's probably going to get left behind a little bit. But it's just so hard in a country like America with the health system the way that it is. It's really hard not to label people, and just to open up services for those that need it and want it. And I think that's part of what psychedelics are teaching us. They're for the people that don't need to have a diagnosis to use them. So we did have a question from Daniel, and I'm going to unmute you now. So we've got two Daniels. I'm going to say Daniel Lucio, welcome, if you'd like to ask your question.
Great, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for all of your input and feedback today. I did put my question in the chat, but I'll just read it for clarity. Stephen, you had mentioned that novel series or sci-fi series, you know, where there's kind of very hopeful potential for, you know, maybe looking at queerness into the future. So I was curious, you know, I also similarly see psychedelics as a personally transcendent and socially equalizing force. So with that in mind, what role does underscoring individual labels and identity play against these medicines that often obliterate those labels and take us to something that, not for everyone, but often feels like, you know, where we've gone somewhere beyond our sexuality or our gender. It's something that's totally transcended that. So I'm just curious about your guys's feelings about that interplay. You know, on one hand, we're emphasizing maybe, you know, queerness and our individual identities, but on the other hand, the medicine can often take us somewhere much further than that. So I'm just curious about that intersection.
Such a great question, Daniel, and a great exploration. If some of you are familiar with the mystical experience questionnaire, which I don't think a lot of researchers use as much anymore, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's been deemed like a white supremacist questionnaire. But 6 of the 15 questions have to do around oneness and like moving beyond labels and dissolving identities. And that does happen to me in some experiences. And in other experiences, I have an opposite of oneness. I have this like distinctness, and I'm different, and acceptance of my difference. And I get both sometimes. So I grapple with it, and I just come to terms with like, I hold both. And it's hard to say if one is better or another in terms of like a specific outcome in research. But sometimes I transcend labels and feel oneness, and sometimes I really understand what makes me different, and I love that about myself. I don't know what other people have.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that was a beautiful encapsulation, Stephen. I think, you know, so much of working in this space is the and it's the both. And accepting that paradox and that I and not I. So yeah, but I love that question and I love that interplay. I'm excited about, you know, as we surface more of these conversations around seeing each other and seeing the complexity of each other. I'm interested to see, you know, maybe a little bit, Stephen, like your sci-fi series that you were talking about. I feel like we're in this process of surfacing our differences to be able to come together. I feel like part of that oneness and that together and the we is the surfacing and the seeing and the witnessing and the appreciating and accepting of the pieces that pull us apart so that it becomes and we become more of a we together. Not to get too utopian and whatnot, but it just made me think a little bit. I'm interested in the question, and I'm interested in the process we're in collectively around some of these identity questions and where it's leading us to. Is it leading towards separation, or is it leading towards an understanding of who we are and an acceptance that can allow for a relaxing of who we are in relation to ourselves and with each other? And that's what I'm hopeful for.
Yeah, oneness is such an interesting term, and it becomes very conflated with the idea that we are all the same, which is actually not.
Right.
I think it speaks to the idea that we have our unique attributes and we are able to coexist with everyone who have their unique attributes together. And we appreciate that about each other. That to me feels like, when people say I feel a sense of oneness. And I've heard narratives of people running with it and saying, like, I don't see color. There's no need to talk about, sexual diversity. Psychedelics erases all that. We're all the same. We're just humans. And there's some grain of truth to that, to the human part, but you're kind of negating realities for a lot of people when you make that statement.
Yeah, when Chacruna has an event about people of color or an event about gay people, there's always people that respond to that by saying, why are you trying to divide us? Psychedelics are, you're emphasizing the differences and you're pulling us apart, and that's not what psychedelics are for. And when I did my dissertation many years ago, I had two people that were my participants, subjects or whatever, say that they didn't believe that, they thought that the rise of people using ayahuasca would lead to everybody dropping homophobia because they'll see how we're all one. And I later had to tell him about the UDV and their anti-gay statements that they were reading at the beginning of ceremonies, and just many people's private beliefs that they think are, we all think our private beliefs are true, who have private beliefs about gay people or about Black people or about whomever, that come out because psychedelics are not, they're not that strong enough to cut through people's, everybody's had an experience who's taken them of realizing something or having insight into something, but it's not always on the things that, like, we wish that Donald Trump could drink ayahuasca and realize, like, that probably wouldn't happen. If you could get him to drink it, he'd probably have some vision of himself as like leader of the universe or something. So it doesn't work quite like the way people wish it did, or the way I wish it did too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've just got a few minutes left, and so I want to give Dee a chance to talk. And I also wanted to say, Mitchell, you said something I love. Can we be a unified chain of being as one consciousness shared by every living being in the past, present, and future? And also just chill with people liking different stuff, though. Love that. Thanks, Mitchell. Okay, so Dee, if you'd like to tell folks about what you're working on. It's not a question, it's just everyone in the panel was really excited by what you shared.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Dee. I use she, her pronouns. So I worked on this research project with Dr. Christopher, who is works a lot in the MDMA training program with MAPS. And so it was a trans research team, primarily trans and gender diverse research team, and we had focus group discussions with other trans and gender diverse people around, well, we really wanted to look at what's the acceptability of MDMA psychotherapy, but also wanting to understand people's backgrounds and their experience with trauma-informed psychotherapy. So yeah, we have a paper coming out, and it's quite interesting because we have to look at, we're talking about oneness, but like, we live in systems of oppression that were not dismantled by the forefathers of the psychedelic movement. And is life better now? I don't know. I mean, with climate change and the impending crisis, yeah, I think it takes a lot more to look at these structural barriers, these systems, and the trans people and gender diverse people we talked to really showed that quite clearly about how difficult it is just to access psychotherapy, how difficult it is to have the same therapist or have the therapist like understand who they are. Given the people we were talking to were recruited a lot out of the VA hospitals, so they have that government system perspective, which, you know, I think says a lot, because then we also have to think about, as we think about like MDMA rollout, what does implementation science look like? What does it look like in play? So sorry, I'm like a public health person, so I'm like bringing in a lot of that language. So yeah, so we have a paper coming out soon. It's in the MAP special issue, in the Frontiers special issue that's coming out. And then now also this amazing project I'm working on. It's this Italian therapist in Italy is an underground therapist that also works with plant medicines. And she has these like pages of these transcripts of her trans clients giving their own reflections after the plant medicine ceremony. So they use, well, not all plant, they use like MDMA, psilocybin, ayahuasca. So there's like different things, but it's like their reflections over time in these like different transcripts that I've had translated, and I just need to review them. But it's really interesting. So, you know, I just love to hear about what other people are working on. Sorry I came late. But I think it's really cool how there's a lot of really great and interesting work in the queer space bubbling up. I'm complete. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. I'm really happy we kind of squeezed it in. So we are at time. It is 1:30. But before we go, if you don't mind, panelists, if you've got another minute to squeeze in, just love to say thank you. I've really enjoyed it, and it's been amazing hearing you dialogue with each other and hearing some people from the audience as well bring their wisdom in. So if you'd like to share some final thoughts about how you felt the night has been, and if there's any other resources you'd like to direct people to or events that are coming up, yeah, feel free just to let everybody know.
Well, oh, sorry.
Go for it, kind of think over it.
I'm just going to push our book one more time, Queering Psychedelics, and say that we're going to have we're planning on having another conference in 2023 in the same spot in the Brava Theater. So I hope everybody can come. And thank you for having this talk. It was really interesting. Appreciate it. And all the co-panelists as well. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I want to thank my co-panelists as well, and Psychedelics Today, and Dave as well, for such a wonderful facilitation. I feel really called to address Sasha's comments in the chat. I really wish you luck in your process. I unfortunately cannot help you out with the restorative justice process. I have not been a part of one, and I don't know how to, honestly. But I really hope that you'll be able to find someone to help you out in your process. And it hurts me to see you hurting. And I just want to say that.
My final word, I will say, I gotta talk up Chacruna. I mean, such an inspiration for me. I just got an email a few days ago that my annual membership donation thing had been renewed. So I think I discovered Chacruna 2 years ago, and that set me on a path and opened up so many things for me. So thank you so much, Clancy. And I will make sure to thank Bia next time I talk with her. But Chacruna is like the biggest wealth of knowledge and stories as well, and perspectives around queering psychedelics that I've found. So I encourage you to check out Chacruna.
Yeah, and gratitude from my side as well. I have nothing to add, just watch out for a potential a queer integration circle experiment on Meetup. You may if that's my big takeaway, I'm going to try that out. But yeah, it's been such a pleasure and such an honor, and so excited to hear and to connect with all the people who have attended today. And we're finding each other, and I love it, and I'm very excited about it. So thank you, Psychedelics Day, for convening this conversation. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks, everybody. And someone just dropped in the chat about the Fireside project, so definitely check that as well. I know that they now have additional people kind of behind the lines there that are queer identifying, and I think they have good training as well of all the folks there. So if you want to tell people about this talk, they can still watch it for free. It's going to be on our YouTube page. Give us a couple of days to get it up there so you can direct people to Psychedelics Day YouTube. And again, if you could, please make some donation to the Rainbow Railroad project. That would be much appreciated. All right, so thanks very much from me and Stephen and Terence and Amy and Clancy. Wow, this is a pleasure. Really, thank you so much for being here, everybody.
Thank you. Peace out.